Hi class, welcome to chapter 8. And this chapter really talks about kind of an introduction to the brain and the organization of the brain in anatomical structure and function. This is a huge chapter. There's a lot of PowerPoint slides to it. If I would start lecturing on it, I would probably lose most of you in the first 10 minutes. So you guys are responsible for all the information in the PowerPoint itself. I won't ask you many questions on the embryonic development of the brain, so you can kind of take that off. But any sort of anatomical structures of the brain, you should be familiar with the lobes of the brain and what occurs in each lobe, the precentral and postcentral gyrus, the functional regions of the cerebrum you should be familiar with, as well as this slide will help you really lay out all the functions of the different lobes of the brain. So you should generally know the anatomy of the brain and then what each structure in the brain does, the general structure of it. I won't get into too many details other than that, but what I really want to focus on is toward the last 20 slides of this chapter and this PowerPoint. It talks about the spinal cord tracts, and that's what I'll focus on with you guys in this PowerPoint. So the spinal cord tracts are the tracts of brain tissue that your nervous system impulses will travel up and down to get to the brain and then to an effector. So these spinal cord tracts are divided in their function and what they do. So your spinal cord itself is composed of white matter surrounding a gray matter core. And that gray matter core is in the shape of a butterfly in a cross section, if you remember from anatomy. The gray matter is arranged with the left and a right dorsal horn and a left and a right ventral horn. The white matter is composed of the ascending and descending fiber tracts, and these tracts are arranged in 6 columns, which we called funiculi. The ascending tracts that go up to the brain carry all sensory impulses and are given the prefix spino, that indicates the brain region it synapses or has a junction with. And an example of this is the lateral spinothalamic tract. So it will synapse in the thalamus region. And descending tracts carry motor impulses down from the brain to their effector organ or gland, and they're given the suffix spinal, and the prefix indicates the brain region that they come from. And an example is the anterior corticospinal tract. So these ascending tracts convey sensory information from all sensory impulses that are originating in your skin, your muscles, your joints, and organs. The tracts will always decussate. Desiccation is just meaning they will cross over. So the crossover of tracts or decussation may occur in the spinal cord or in the medulla of the brain. And if you don't know what the medulla of the brain is, go back and review your anatomy in the previous slides. And this just means that the origin of the input and the brain are contralateral. So if you receive a stimulus input from the right side of your body, it'll go up to your brain, but it'll cross over and go to the left side of your brain. And that crossing over of tracts is called decussation. So this tells you the principal ascending tracts of the spinal cord. So these are some tracts, these 4 tracts, where they originate, where they terminate, and what the function is. So these are all ascending tracts, so they will all conduct sensory information, pain, temperature, sensory impulses from different parts of the body and up to the brain. And most of them, some of them terminate in the cerebellum, some of them terminate in the medulla or the thalamus. So this is a look at the tracts. And again, think of these ascending tracts, it's just the pathway that some sort of stimulus takes as it goes up to your brain. So let's say your foot is next to a hot fire. That temperature receptor travels up the brain. It decussates or crosses over right away in the spinal cord, and then it'll travel up the opposite side of the spinal cord into the brain. Touch receptors, joint receptors, pain receptors, they all have different tracts that they travel up in the white matter or the funiculi of the spinal cord. There's 2 major groups of descending tracts. They can be corticospinal or pyramidal. They will descend directly without synaptic interruption from your cerebral cortex in the brain to the spinal cord. So these are the descending motor tracts to the spinal interneurons and motor neurons. And again, they're called descending motor tracts because anything that descends in the spinal cord from the brain will have a motor impulse. So that impulse will go into any skeletal muscle or gland that impulse will innervate. So these are the different tracts. The category where they originate, they will all originate in some part of the brain. Some of them will originate in the midbrain or medulla. And this crossed or uncrossed just says if they cross over to the opposite side of the body or not. So this is a look at a descending pyramidal tract. You can see how it goes down. And depending on the tract, it might not always cross over to the opposite side of the body. The Babinski reflex, or the Babinski sign, occurs normally in infants and children under 2 years of old. And you should try this if you have any kids who are less than 2 years of age or any nieces or nephews. This reflex involves an upward movement of the big toe and a fanning of the other toes when the sole of the foot is stimulated. So just take a pencil and take it along the sole of the foot of a baby, and they should just stretch out their toes and their big toe, and this is called the Babinski reflex. Once the central nervous system has developed more fully, the descending pyramidal tracts actually inhibit this reflex. So in adults, the opposite will occur. So you can practice this on an adult who allows you to do this, but you can take a pencil, stimulate, or rub a pencil along the sole of their foot, and the same stimulation actually evokes a downward flexion, so their toes will push downward, or curling of the toes. So that's really kind of a fun thing that you guys can do on your own. The Babinski reflex in kids less than 2 years of age, take a pencil, place it on the sole of their foot, their toes should spread apart and stretch out, but in adults, they should curl. A Babinski reflex in an adult can indicate a central nervous system damage due to such conditions like a spinal cord injury, ALS, multiple sclerosis, or brain tumors, or others. So I just found out someone I knew has brain tumors in his brain, and I'm certain they did the Babinski reflex on him to see if his toes curled. So descending tracts, extrapyramidal tracts originate in the brainstem and are controlled by the motor circuits of the corpus striatum, which are parts of the midbrain. Some symptoms of Parkinson's disease reveal the importance of these tracts for initiating body movements, maintaining posture, and controlling facial expressions. A little more on extrapyramidal tracts. I won't ask you many questions on the details of these. So these are higher motor neuron control of skeletal muscles, just showing how the motor control of your muscles will initiate in the cerebral cortex, and then they'll travel down these motor tracts to lower motor neurons. The cranial and spinal nerves then, so this will hopefully be a little bit of review. Your cranial nerves are part of your peripheral nervous system. So again, the central nervous system is all of your brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system are all of your cranial nerves and spinal nerves. These cranial nerves arise directly from nuclei within the brain. You have 12 pairs of them, and most are mixed, which means they will have both sensory and motor neurons. So we say they are somatic and parasympathetic. Those associated with vision, olfaction, and hearing are sensory only and have their cell bodies and ganglia located near the sensory organ. This slide is really hard to see, but this just gives you a good review of the 12 cranial nerves, what makes up the cranial nerves and their general function. I won't ask you guys what composes each cranial nerve, but you should know the general function of each of the 12 cranial nerves. Some of their functions directly relate to the name of the nerve. So the olfactory nerve has to do with smell or olfaction. The accessory nerve innervates some of the muscles in your shoulders. The hypoglossal nerve innervates some of the muscles of the tongue. So you should have a good understanding of the 12 cranial nerves and their general function. So the spinal nerves are also part of the peripheral nervous system. They will come directly off of the spinal cord, and you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, so one on each side of that level in the spinal cord, and they're named for what vertebra they come out beneath. You have 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal, and all are also mixed nerves. And and they separate near the spinal cord into a dorsal root, which carries sensory fibers, and a ventral root out the front carries motor fibers. The dorsal root ganglion will house the sensory neuron cell bodies, and motor neuron cell bodies will be in the ventral gray horns. So again, this looks at the distribution of spinal nerves. You have 31 pairs. Here's your cranial nerves up there, and then your spinal nerves all come off the spinal cord. The reflex arc is an unconscious motor response to a sensory stimulus. And you should know the parts of an arc. This is extremely important, and I want you guys to know this. You should know the parts of an arc begin with a sensory receptor, a sensory neuron, the association neuron in the central nervous system, the motor neuron, and then the effector, the muscle or gland that responds. Reflex arcs can be somatic, which means they will affect skeletal muscles, or autonomic, which means they will affect smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. So this is the basic steps or pieces of a reflex arc. You have a sensory neuron. In this case, the sensory neuron is in the skin, and it travels in the dorsal root through the dorsal root ganglia into the spinal cord. The spinal cord, the sensory neuron synapses on an interneuron, which will most likely be in the gray matter, and then the motor root will come out of the ventral root, out of the front part of the spinal cord, and it turns into a somatic motor neuron because the somatic motor neuron will control skeletal muscle. So what are we talking about this? This means that if you touch a hot stove and the pain receptors in your skin feel that heat sensation, within an instant, this reflex arc takes that hot pain sensation to your spinal cord, and then it sends out an effector out of the ventral root into a motor neuron, and it tells your muscle to release your hand off of the stove. So a reflex arc is involuntary, meaning it happens without you realizing it, and it will often happen without any input from the brain. So this reflex arc will just go into and out of the spinal cord, and it won't travel up to the brain at all. So this is an involuntary response, and it's good because it helps you get away quickly from pain or heat or anything that would damage your body. So I do want you to know the basic steps of the reflex arc. At the beginning of this PowerPoint, you should be familiar with the basic anatomy and function, but I want you to focus kind of on these last 20, 25 slides. Thanks for listening, guys.